At the end of chapter 677, Yhwach refers to Ichigo as a child in despair, but Ichigo responds by saying, "What about despair?" because he knows all about it. He's been through it so many times, and time again he has proven to overcome these feelings of despair. Now this moment within the manga really got me thinking about the growth of Ichigo's character, including all of the moments within the series where he was utterly defeated. He had no reason to get back up, and things were looking genuinely hopeless for him. But despite how badly the odds were stacked against him, Ichigo did indeed time and time again brush himself off and get back up again. And this alone is an incredibly powerful gesture for Kubo to convey through his manga. Sometimes we may not completely grasp how powerful these moments are within fictional media, until we may have gone through our own traumatic experiences which make us sink into despair. I know for one that I was deeply impacted every time that I had seen Ichigo get back up in the face of adversity. Now while I may love this aspect of Ichigo's character, there is a vocal minority who assumes that Ichigo giving into despair and momentarily feeling upset or even crying is a sign of weakness in his character, going as far as to say that this is regression. In life, you don't just overcome one experience and then suddenly never feel sad or cry ever again. How despair is depicted within Bleach is very realistic. In this video, I want to talk about the theme of despair and why it is so important to understand the growth of Ichigo's character, and why in actual fact it is through despair that Ichigo develops, contrary to the opinions of others who assume that Ichigo crying is a sign of weakness. So this is going to be a pretty deep video. We're going to be talking about the topic of despair and how this can stem from depression and anxiety or other underlying mental health issues, and how sometimes escaping into fictional stories like Bleach can teach us a little something about overcoming these feelings of despair. So without further delay, let's dive into the topic of this video. This is my explanation of how Kubo writes the theme of overcoming despair into his story. Before the video begins, only 20% of the people who actually watch my content are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy these videos, then subscribe and stick around for more content just like this. Now let's get back to the topic of the video. The term despair is used to describe a complete loss or an absence of hope. Up until the age of 9, Ichigo led a pretty normal life, aside from the fact that he could see ghosts, and even as a child he had a desire to protect his younger sisters, which had led him to join a karate dojo, where he would of course become friends with Tatsuki. The only despair he would have probably felt at this age was if he was being picked on by bullies, but if this was the case, then Tatsuki was always there to help him and to cheer him up if he was upset. It was evident that at this point Ichigo was a mummy's boy. After losing to Tatsuki in almost every karate match that they had, he would be upset and his eyes would well up with tears. That is until his mother would arrive to pick him up, and her presence would immediately change Ichigo's mood, as he would wipe away his tears and smile instantly. I'm saying this to demonstrate how dependent Ichigo was on his mother and how much he had unconditionally loved her. So on the 17th of June at the age of 9, when his mother had tried to protect him from the lure of the Grand Fisher, she ended up dying as Ichigo would regain consciousness, realizing that his mother is laying on top of him, shielding him and covered in blood. This traumatic childhood experience will be the source of where Ichigo's feelings of despair would stem from, especially in situations where he would feel powerless, like when his inner hollow had interrupted his battle against Yami, which had led to Orihime being hurt by the Arankar, or when Ichigo was defeated by Grimmjow and he could do nothing to prevent Rukia from being hurt by him. As early as chapter 18, we learn that Ichigo feels responsible for the death of his mother. When Ichigo and his family visit her grave to pay respects to her, Rukia follows them and asks Ichigo whether if his mother was killed by a hollow, but Ichigo tells her that he was responsible for her death. He doesn't realize that he was only a child and that it wasn't his responsibility to protect his mother. At this point, he feels resentment for the Grand Fisher, as the hollow had killed his mother while he feels that he was powerless to do anything about it, despite only being 9 years old at the time. This is why he is so determined to face off against the hollow, even when he is badly injured and the Grand Fisher escapes. Rukia tries to convince him that he can no longer continue fighting, but he insists. For Ichigo, defeating the Grand Fisher will avenge the death of his mother, but at this point he has only recently acquired his powers. Despite his insistence on continuing to fight, he ends up collapsing, and in chapter 25 his father tells him that nobody blames him for the death of Masaki. After he realizes the importance of gaining the powers of a Shinigami, he asks Rukia to allow him to be a Shinigami for a while longer. With these powers, he was able to overcome his feelings of powerlessness. At the end of the Substitute Shinigami arc, Ichigo once again again was made to endure despair when he was swiftly taken out by Byakuya, and Rukia was taken to the Soul Society. He had initially arrived to protect Rukia, but it appears as though Rukia had protected him instead. This is a powerful moment where Ichigo is laying in a pool of his own blood with rain pouring down upon him. He yells out in frustration as he was unable to do anything to help Rukia here. We know that he is assisted by Urahara and is taught about his own innate Shinigami powers that he possesses, and through his training he gains the strength to infiltrate the Soul Society and face off against all of the Gotei 13 in a life-threatening attempt to rescue Rukia. While Ichigo demonstrates an incredible amount of resolve during the Soul Society arc, he is brought to the brink of defeat during his battle against Kinpachi. When his opponent is disappointed that Ichigo did not live up to his expectations, he walks away from him as Ichigo once again finds himself in a pool of his own blood, pleading with his body to get back up so that he can continue fighting. While still fairly early into his infiltration of the Soul Society, there is no way that he can stop here. He has to continue pushing forward if he has any chance of rescuing Rukia, the one who has been sentenced for death for granting Ichigo with the gift of the power to protect. By giving him the powers of the Shinigami, she had figuratively saved Ichigo. This is why the first chapter of Bleach is called Death in the Strawberry, death referring to Rukia and strawberry referring to Ichigo, and how this was one instance of many occasions where the death had saved the strawberry. She had saved Ichigo by giving him power, then saving him from being killed by Byakuya when she was being taken to the Soul Society, then returning during the Arrancar arc to lift Ichigo's spirits when he was being troubled by his inner hollow, and lastly she played one of the most active roles within the fullbringer arc, where she had actually saved Ichigo from powerlessness once more by being in charge of the Reishi sword, which would be used to return Ichigo's Shinigami powers back to him. Prior to the start of the series, we learned that Ichigo had realized that fate was cruel and merciless. This is why he had wanted power to fight back against fate. He wanted to protect those who are at the mercy of the cogs of fate, which would have otherwise crushed them. By wielding a sword, he wants to crush fate and to save and protect as many people as he can. We know that Ichigo was able to get back up during his battle against Kinpachi through the help of Old Man Zangetsu, and by being introduced to this spirit that resides within Ichigo's inner world, we learn more about Ichigo's mental state, as Old Man Zangetsu and Tensa Zangetsu later reveal that Ichigo's inner world is a reflection of his emotions. They explain that when Ichigo is sad or he is feeling despair, then it begins to rain upon his inner world. Old Man Zangetsu goes as far as to say that he'll do anything to stop Ichigo from feeling sadness, in order to prevent the rain from falling in Ichigo's lonely inner world. The next time that we see Ichigo powerless is during chapter 174, when he is swiftly taken down by Aizen, and he is unable to do anything to prevent Aizen from taking the Hokyoku from Rukia, and then leaving for Huekumundo, as Aizen refers to Ichigo as being interesting for a human. And as I mentioned earlier on, during the Arrancar arc, we see Ichigo being troubled by his inner hollow. This spirit that resides within Ichigo wants to take over his body. His inner hollow manifests and interrupts his battles when Ichigo exerts a large amount of spiritual pressure. We see this during his battle against Yami, when his inner hollow tries to take over, but Ichigo rejects it, and this momentary distraction gives Yami enough time to hurt Orihime. And a similar instance occurs where he continues to reject his hollow powers, and he ends up being defeated by Grimmjow, and Rukia is also critically wounded as a result of this battle. He is made to feel despair because he has this personality living within him that is constantly telling him that he is not good enough. It is threatening him that he will be consumed and will be a shell of his former self, and he is powerless to do anything about it. He is feeling a great deal of turmoil, and the negativity of his inner hollow is somewhat sinking Ichigo into despair. Through seeking help from the Vizards, Ichigo is able to gain back some control from his inner hollow, as he is able to voluntarily summon his hollow powers through manifesting a hollow mask. When Orihime is taken to Huekumundo by Ukiara, Ichigo infiltrates the land of the hollows, desiring to rescue her. But what makes this infiltration very different from the Soul Society is that Ichigo is defeated by Ukiara very early on. When he learns that it was Ukiara who had brought Orihime to Huekumundo, he immediately challenges the Espada, but as we know, he stands no chance against the 4th ranking Espada. When he stabs Ichigo through the chest with his hand, and it appears as though he has been killed, Grimmjow brings Ichigo's body to Orihime in order for her to heal him. In this instance, when Ukiara defeats Ichigo, it was prior to Ichigo demonstrating his resolve to not give up, as he assumes that Ukiara is the leader of the Espada, so if he defeats him, then he has won the war against the Arrancar. But when Ukiara reveals that he is the 4th ranking Espada, it visibly shocks Ichigo, and his bravado of not wanting to give up soon wanes, as his momentary shock results in him freezing up, allowing for Ukiara to impale him through the chest. Now the next time that Ichigo is made to feel sadness or despair is during his final battle against Ulquiorra. During this encounter, he has no hope of winning, as Ulquiorra firmly demonstrates this, as the Espada begins to get frustrated with Ichigo's illogical belief that he has some chance of winning. When Ulquiorra gets rid of any hope that Ichigo may have by firing a Sero through his chest and practically killing Ichigo, he ends up returning in his Vastolore form, and while in this transformed state, he defeats Ulquiorra. But when Ichigo regains his sanity, he is regretful and expresses remorse for Ulquiorra, as he didn't want to defeat him in this way. And this is an important character trait that Ichigo has. He is forgiving and even feels remorse for his enemies. But this is something that I'll touch upon later on in the video. But in this instance, you can tell that Ichigo is actually saddened for the way that Ulquiorra was killed. After all, this was the first life that Ichigo had actually taken, even if he wasn't completely in his senses. Now, during the fake Karakura Town arc, Ichigo once again sinks into despair when Aizen tells him that he had orchestrated all of the encounters that Ichigo had taken part in, and that he was born special. At this point, Ichigo knows that there is something being hidden from him by his father, but at least he respects his father's decision to not tell him yet, as he states that he will wait for his father to reveal the truth to him when he feels like the time is right. And I don't really think the impatient Ichigo at the start of the series would have done this. Towards the end portion of the arc, Ichigo once again feels hopelessness when he senses the difference and true scale of power that Aizen has now attained. After Aizen leaves for the Soul Society, he ends up telling his father that it is hopeless to fight against Aizen. That is, until he is taken into the Dangai and he undergoes his final Getsuga Tensho training. Now, when we think about Ichigo truly sinking into despair, most of us will probably recall the memorable Fullbringer arc, which had made Ichigo feel completely hopeless. Through this arc, we really get to appreciate what it meant for Ichigo to gain the power to protect from Rukia. He ends up regaining his hope once again when he acquires his own Fullbringer powers, but when these very powers are stolen by Ginjo, this leads to one of the most iconic instances of despair within the entire story that Ichigo experiences. When Ichigo loses his newly acquired powers, Ichigo sheds tears as he sinks deep into this despair of feeling powerless. Those 17 months finally catch up to him and strike him at his very core in one instance. He realizes the significance of what it meant to him to be a Shinigami, and he realizes why Tensa Zangetsu was so afraid of teaching him the final Getsuga Tensho, because he was aware that Ichigo would suffer without his powers. And this is what happens exactly here. Ichigo continues to feel hopeless until the Soul Society arrives, as they repay their debt of gratitude for Ichigo defeating Aizen, as they return his Shinigami powers back to him. Now, the events of the Thousand Year Blood War arc challenge Ichigo's character like no other arc, and it was actually chapter 677 of this story arc which had inspired me to even create this video. So during the first invasion of the Quincy, Ichigo is made to feel despair after he is defeated by Yhwach, and he is told that he doesn't know the truth about his mother, as it is vaguely alluded that Ichigo has Quincy heritage. At this instance, Ichigo feels conflicted and begins to feel despair. Firstly, for the fact that he could do nothing to stop the Quincy from annihilating the Soul Society, and secondly because he doesn't know who he truly is. Somehow the topic of his mother has been brought up, and her death appears to be involved somehow with the antagonists of this story arc, and it results in Ichigo feeling conflicted as to what he should do. When he begins to feel despair and regret that he couldn't do anything to help the Soul Society, he starts to decide against going to the Royal Palace to restore his Bankai, as he offers to help his friends in Hueco Mundo. That is, until Urahara literally tells Ichigo to do what's best for himself now, because time and time again he has distracted himself from his underlying reason behind why he sinks into despair, which we as the reader know stems from Ichigo's powerlessness that had originated from his inability to protect his mother when he was only 9 years old. Now, after Ichigo learns the truth about his mother and how she had died, he reaffirms his resolve to defeat Yhwach, the man who was actually responsible for his mother's death. Not too long after, he immediately learns about another shocking revelation that shakes him to his core, as he finds out that Old Man Zangetsu, who was somebody who had acted as a second father figure to Ichigo, had actually been an imposter and was lying to him this entire time. Ichigo has an intense emotional response, and like he does, he yells out in frustration as he calls out to Old Man Zangetsu. The emotional turmoil that Ichigo is experiencing in this instance is illustrated by Kubo through how Ichigo enters enters into his inner world, and there is an intense downpouring of rain, and before too long his entire inner world is submerged underwater. Earlier on, I'd spoken about how rain within Ichigo's inner world illustrates Ichigo's feelings of sadness, and that the last time that he was completely submerged within his inner world was during his fight against Tensa Zangetsu, where his fear of his inner hollow and his vast Lorde transformation was troubling him. Now in this instance, his inner world has been submerged underwater because he feels like he has been lied to, but he soon realizes that Old Man Zangetsu and his inner hollow have only wanted the best for Ichigo. He then realizes that he no longer needs to rely upon them like he has been doing, and he demonstrates his growth by stating that he holds nothing against them. The final time within Bleach that we see Ichigo truly sink into despair is when Yhwach destroys Ichigo's new Tensa Zangetsu in the future. The leader of the Quincy reveals his ability the Almighty, which allows him to not only see the future but to also alter it. Yhwach states that Ichigo has overcome despair and changed the future countless times through utilizing his powers, but this was only made possible because Yhwach was not there to alter the future, which would reverse Ichigo's actions. He tells Ichigo not to despair, but of course the hopelessness of the situation leads to Ichigo yelling out in frustration. There appears to be nothing that he can do, and when it seems as though Ichigo has given up, as he realizes that his Zanpakuto isn't effective, as are Orihime's shields, which means that he can no longer fight back against Yhwach, he admits to himself that it is over, as Yhwach then takes away Ichigo's hollow and Quincy powers. Our protagonist collapses to the floor as Yhwach laughs in his face. This is truly a devastating, despair-filled scenario, and it is one that Kubo depicts masterfully through Ichigo's facial expressions here. We know that Ichigo is literally helped back to his feet by the arrival of Renji, as he wants them to continue fighting, even if all hope seems to be lost. Renji believes here that it is better to die fighting than to die wallowing in your own self-pity and feelings of powerlessness. We are aware that Ichigo was ultimately able to defeat Yhwach thanks to the help of Tsukishima and Orihime, who together use their powers to restore Ichigo's Zanpakuto, thus allowing him to face off against his largest obstacle to date, as he overcomes the despair he had felt thanks to the help of his friends, and ultimately his belief in himself. Now we've pretty much covered every instance that Ichigo feels despair within the series. I want to now talk about how Ichigo as a character experiences defeat within Bleach, and how it is different to shonen characters like Goku. Now when Goku is defeated, he never really lets the defeat sink in and momentarily get the better of him. In some instances, when Ichigo actually feels despair, Kubo writes him with negative thoughts that reveals that he has given up, like when he thinks it is impossible to defeat Aizen after he leaves for the Soul Society to go to the real Karakura town, or when he feels that it is impossible to defeat Yhwach after realizing that he can alter the future. Now this is powerful and purposeful weakness that Kubo writes into Ichigo, and ultimately this is what makes him as a protagonist feel real and relatable. He isn't some uber positive meat-eating optimist. He has moments of despair that he struggles to overcome, and in these instances he is assisted by the love and support of those around him, the very people that he sacrifices so much for and uses his powers to protect. Now while characters like Goku rely on their own strength, determination and belief in the goal of becoming the strongest, Ichigo actually feels hopelessness and even gives up sometimes, but he ends up being lifted up by those around him, which in my opinion is a welcomed change from typical shonen stories. I actually want to see a protagonist go through and feel the lows of despair. I want them to feel it instead of brushing it aside, and this reminds me of the best manga that in my opinion depicts the emotion of despair, which is Berserk. That even supersedes Bleach when it comes to how it makes its protagonist feel and actually sink into despair, and the actions that the protagonist takes to overcome that feeling. Coming back to Ichigo, when he feels this emotion, you see his shocked expressions, the feeling of defeat that he feels, and the consequences of losing, which most of the time means the loss of one of his friends, or the altering of reality itself, which will mean that he would lose everything that he cherishes. You can see all of these consequences running through his mind as he sinks further into despair and his negative self-talk. And this is something that everyone has to some extent, that voice in your mind that tells you that you are not good enough, and that it is impossible for you to succeed, so why try at all? And this is exactly what Ichigo experiences during the end of the 1000-year Blood War arc. Now when it comes to the real world application of despair, it can stem from depression or anxiety, and most often or not, these mental health issues stem from some traumatic experience that we had in the past, whether if this was in our recent past or as early as our childhood. I know that during the pandemic, a lot of us were isolated, our regular routines were disrupted, all of the things that we would have typically done to distract ourselves from facing our own selves and our own thoughts were no longer there. So when when you're stuck in your own room and you have nothing but your own thoughts to occupy you with, it can take you to some pretty dark places. I know not everybody's going to be able to relate to this, but I watch shonen stories and fell in love with Bleach in particular because of its messages of overcoming despair. One of the key things when it comes to accepting what had happened in our past and to overcome these feelings of despair that may stem from negative past experiences is to actually forgive those who had wronged you and to learn to let go of the resentment that you hold against them, as you actually acknowledge that resenting others would hold you back and keep you in despair. This is something that we actually see within Bleach, as Ichigo forgives Byakuya and holds nothing against him, as he realizes that he wasn't at fault. He was only following the rules and the law and order of the Soul Society when it came to Rukia's execution, or how Ichigo had defended Grimmjow against Noitora, despite Grimmjow having caused him so much turmoil in the past when it came to hurting Rukia or actually beating him to a pulp. And then continuing from this, how Ichigo had regrets about defeating Ulquiorra the way that he did, despite Ulquiorra being a complete nihilist who had brought Ichigo to the verge of death twice. One of the most shocking instances is when Ichigo feels remorse for Aizen after he defeats him, as he states that he had felt loneliness emanating from his Zanpakuto, and if Ichigo wasn't able to really let go of the resentment that he had towards Aizen and everything that he had done, then he wouldn't have teamed up with him during the 1000-year Blood War arc in his fight against Yhwach. And then when it comes to the fullbringer arc, Ichigo ends up forgiving Ginjo, despite the fact that he had betrayed him, stolen his powers, and had manipulated all of his friends and family. He doesn't resent his enemy here, even going as far as to respect him after his death, as he wants to bury his body in the real world. And the final instance where we see Ichigo demonstrate forgiveness or letting go of his past is when he forgives himself, as for the longest time Ichigo has been resenting himself, as he had felt responsible for the death of his mother. But we see that after he learns about his past through the Everything But the Rain flashback, he learns to accept what had happened in the past and that he wasn't at fault for it, and what his father had said as early as chapter 25 was true. Nobody holds Ichigo responsible for the death of Masaki. It took some time, but he finally learned to accept this, which demonstrates growth for Ichigo's character. I'm truly grateful for inspiring stories like Bleach that teach us to overcome the adversities that we may face in our own lives, as we realize that things are not as hopeless as they may seem, as there is always a way out of any hole that we may find ourselves in. Bleach's depiction of overcoming despair was a constant motivator for me, especially if you have your own experiences of past trauma that hold you back even to this day. So on occasion, when I get thoughts of despair that come creeping into my mind, I always think back to all of the moments within Bleach where despair was defeated by persistently believing in yourself and fighting against those emotions for a better future. If you relate to anything that I've spoken about in this video, then know that despair is not enough to stop you. Keep pursuing your goals and don't let any demons from the past hold you back. Let go of feelings of resentment and, like Ichigo, overcome your despair. I'd like to thank you for making it to the end of this video, and if you want to continue the discussion about the theme of despair within Bleach, then definitely leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Also, leave your feedback if you like this deep and more personal video from me and you want to see more like it, then I'd love to post some follow-up videos elaborating on some of the points that I've mentioned. But for now, thank you for your time, and I can't wait to see you in my next Bleach video. If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.